welcome to today's AT&T CyberThreat Report. This is October 13th, 2011. Joining us today, we have Jim Clausing. Jim is a lead malware analyst on our team here. Welcome, Jim. What do you plan to discuss today?
Well, I want to talk a little bit about the newest Android malware called BeanBot, and then a little update on some of the security updates that came out from Microsoft and Apple earlier this week.
All right, great, thanks. And we also have John Hogoboom here today. John is a lead security analyst on our team. He does some analysis tools development as well. Welcome, John. What do you plan to discuss?
Hey, Brian. Today I have some information on some peer-to-peer functionality that's been added to a particular variant of Zeus, and we'll talk about that. And I have some other Zeus-related news that I wanted to talk about as well. Okay.
You know, Zeus is a nasty one, so it's worth keeping tabs on that one. And I'm Brian Rexroad. I function as a part of our security analysis team here as well. And I have a little segment that I'd like to talk about related to DNS security. DNS is an important aspect of the Internet infrastructure, and so it makes sense to pay attention to it, obviously. And we'll also cover the Internet Weather Report, which is a regular segment of the program. So let's go ahead and, Jim, I guess you have a little introductory topic to discuss here with us.
Yes, it's with some sadness that we note the passing this past weekend of Dennis Ritchie, who was a longtime employee of Bell Labs and best known for his work in developing the C programming language and the Unix operating system. And he and Ken Thompson were Turing Award winners, and they won the IEEE, the Maxwell, or the Hamming Medal, and the National Medal of Technology. And so it's a real big loss for the community.
Yeah, I agree. I think for anybody that's doing programming, particularly in C, even today, the C programming language is the book from Dennis Ritchie and Company is actually a sort of a staple. It's one of those. I think John's looking up on his shelf here.
Yeah, I was looking to see if I have mine here.
Yeah, I have it on my shelf in my other office. So.
Yeah, so absolutely, I think that is a loss. And I can't help but notice that. It seems as if in the last couple of months there have been a few different losses here. Notably, Robert Morris passed away recently, and we also had Steve Jobs recently. Now Dennis Ritchie. I hope this isn't a continuing trend here, but certainly he will be missed. So thank you for bringing that up, Jim. And without further ado, let's take it to John. John, let's talk a little more about Zeus yet again.
All right. So we've talked about Zeus before. It's a crimeware toolkit. It's been around mostly since about 2009, although there's been some, I guess it had been known about since 2007, but it really started to pick up speed in 2009. It's a pay-for hacker toolkit. You can get it in the underground. There's various prices for the various modules you can get. In any event, it's been out there for a while. There are a lot of little Zeus operations in effect, so I can go out there as a bad guy, get the toolkit, and start my own Zeus Botnet. So when people talk about Zeus, it's not one botnet. It's a bunch of different people running their own little Zeus botnets. In any event, sometime earlier this year, the source code was released around the April-May time frame of this year. And also there was an interesting variant released around the same time. Actually, it was in April. It's called Murofet. And the Murofet botnet it's a modification of the original Zeus source code, but what it was doing is it was actually a file infector, Murofet. So it would go and infect the files on your machine. So if you had an executable like notepad.exe, it could inject itself into notepad.exe, such that when you ran Notepad, it would go check to see if there's a version, make sure the machine's infected still. If not, go get the new version, reinfect the machine. So it was a way to keep the machine to get it reinfected. So it's basically a downloader used as a file infector. In any event, Murofet, we're getting reports that Murofet recently added in some new functionality to have peer-to-peer functionality for its command and control and for update. So what it can do now actually is it has a seed list in it, just like a lot of peer-to-peer software, legitimate stuff, and other botnets that we've seen that use peer-to-peer. And when it starts up, it will try to contact other peers on that seed list and then kind of extend its network or its visibility into the peer-to-peer network out. And if it talks to a peer who has an updated version of the binary, it will download the new version of the binary, so it uses that for its updates and whatnot. So it's a pretty sophisticated addition to Zeus. Plus, it helps in terms of, right now, Zeus, for the most part, has used centralized command and control. Sometimes they use fast flux to kind of hide some of that, but for the most part, it's kind of a one-way direction path where it's a particular domain name it goes to, or a fully qualified domain name to go get its update. But this allows it to be very decentralized, makes it a little more difficult to shut down. So we'll have to keep an eye on it. This is kind of new news. It's not the first botnet to use peer-to-peer. We've had Walladac and Storm are some notable ones. There's been others as well of lesser notoriety. So something to keep an eye out for.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, as you know, we've been working, we have research activities related to this as well as production-level capabilities for identifying peer-to-peer botnets, tracking the command and control associated with the botnets, the fast flux activity as well. I think, but ultimately what it comes down to, as you said, as botnets continue to add these more sophisticated tools for avoiding detection, avoiding tracking, and ultimately avoiding being blocked, it makes it more difficult to protect against things. So what it seems to suggest, in my opinion, is we still need to be working very hard and dealing with the malware aspects of this, and also on the other end of the spectrum, if you will, creating inhibitors that is on the financial side of the botnets, that is to, and from a criminal point of view as well, to make sure that there are inhibitors in place that make it less lucrative to be operating these sorts of botnets.
Yeah. I got my hands on one of these samples. I'm going to start looking at it, but it looks like the command and control mechanism is similar to some of the other P2P botnets that we've seen, but that's going to make it harder to shut things down.
Mm-hmm.
So generally speaking, is there a typical way that the Zeus botnet gets propagated?
Well, the primary way that I usually see is via spam emails. They'll spam out an email. It'll have some kind of, and I'm actually going to talk about that in one more second here. But there's a lot, basically Zeus does not come with, the toolkit does not come with a method to distribute it. So whoever buys it needs to come up with their own method to infect machines. A lot of times it's done just through plain old spam emails, but sometimes they'll post it to Facebook or other social networking websites. That's another popular one. There's probably others that I'm forgetting about, but
those are the biggies, yeah.
Generally not self-propagating, though. It's some sort of basically. Very good.
Not that I'm aware of. I haven't ever seen a Zeus one that's self-propagating, because that would be more worm-like. It's not really designed to act in that way.
Yeah.
Okay.
One other thing I wanted to mention, related to Zeus, not related to this particular peer-to-peer one, but we see Zeus all the time get spammed out in email. There has been a kind of a run lately, so we monitor a lot of the spam traffic that happens, unsolicited spam email, and generate reports on kind of the trends that we see. One of the trends I've been seeing lately, and we kind of been reporting this over time, but for sure we're actually seeing now that there are some fake, just to be clear, because I mentioned this last week, it's a fake DHL email. So it looks like it's coming from DHL. It is not. It's not really from them. But it looks like it is. And the general gist of the email is saying that you tried to send a package. The address that you're trying to send to is not found, so there's a problem. Please look at this attachment. It'll have a zip file in here. It's inside the zip is an executable. If you run that, that's a Zeus payload. So we've been seeing a lot of these get distributed as such, and they'll actually have kind of a file format here of like a word like undeliver, or there's a couple other variations with some numbers tacked on the end here .zip. So that's what we're seeing. So just keep an eye out for that. And for the most part, a lot of them are DHL or purporting to be from DHL. So just keep an eye out. We've been seeing the trend upturn in that this past week specifically. So
it's the old executable and the email tricking.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. And they're getting through a lot of the automated spam filters. You know, there's a lot of services, and the one that we collect our spam probe information from has analysis in there to look at the attachments to see if there's malware in there, and they're getting through. So these are not being picked up by antivirus as they get processed by the mail processing systems, or at least the ones that we're using in a couple of our spam probe collection centers.
And do you think that's because of the packing that's being used? Any theories why?
I think it's just because Zeus is, when you buy the Zeus toolkit, you actually build your own binary. Mm-hmm. So unless you have an antivirus software that's very good heuristically at looking at what's packed in that executable, it's not going to be able to detect it, because it's a totally different MD5 sum for every one that gets built by whoever's running it, and they can change it, as often as they like. That's my guess as to why it's so evasive.
Okay. All right. Thanks, John. All right. Next we have Jim here. Jim, you had a couple of things on Android malware.
Yeah, I just today saw a notice about the newest piece of Android malware called Beanbot. Beanbot is included in, it's being distributed in some repackaged free versions of paid apps. Same kind of thing that a lot of the other Android malware in the past has used to propagate. It wraps up what at least purports to be a free version of a paid app, and folks think they're getting something for free. This particular one so far has only been noticed in some of the third-party marketplaces, and this one sends once it's infected a handset, it sends the IMEI number to its command and control, and then the command and control basically tells it to send some premium SMS messages, things that'll get billed to the user, but it intercepts it so the user doesn't see that they're sending them. It's very similar to some of the stuff we've seen in the past. One of the things, though, that kind of got our attention with this one is that the DNS domain that was used for command and control is a domain that we've actually previously seen associated with Zeus. Now, we, at this point in time, don't have any concrete evidence that there's any relationship between this particular piece of malware and any of the Zeus stuff. It's just one that happens to have its command and control hosted in a domain where apparently they allow registration without too much checking, so there have been some other criminal activity in that domain.
Yeah, so it could be a matter of coincidence here. I know that I guess we have seen some cases in the past where we have seen some mobility-oriented malware that seemed to be a little more directly associated with Zeus, but it sounds like perhaps might be more of just a co-location in terms of domain name.
At this point, that's what I'm leaning towards. I don't see any evidence to make me think that it's anything more than a coincidence at this point. As we keep an eye on it, maybe something more will come out of it. But at this point, it looks like that's just a coincidence at this point.
All righty. Well, I guess maybe not a coincidence, but a matter of convenience, so to speak.
Yeah. So the other things that I wanted to mention briefly, this being the week of the second Tuesday, Microsoft did their usual monthly updates, and this month there were only 2 of them that they rated as critical out of the 8 bulletins that they released on Tuesday. And obviously, folks need to be testing the patches and getting them deployed as quickly as practical in their environments, because the bad guys will be reverse engineering the patches, and if they don't already have exploits for this stuff, they'll create them soon. The one thing that I wanted to highlight about the Microsoft updates here, the MS11-078, the .NET Silverlight one, is actually and that's one of the ones that was rated as critical. That one is actually potentially a cross-platform thing. Silverlight actually exists on, for example, under Mac OS. There's a port for it, and so I believe that Microsoft has already pushed the patch for Mac OS for this. But on the heels of Tuesday's patches from Microsoft, on Wednesday, Apple announced iOS 5 and also released a couple of additional patches. The big one that anybody that's running Mac OS and using Safari needs to make sure they apply as soon as possible is the patch to Safari. There's a proof of concept code out there. And in fact, I saw a demo of this on my own Mac yesterday. Basically, the issue with Safari, what they fixed was a vulnerability where if somebody with a control of a web page someplace were to put a tag with a URI of file:// they could run just about any executable on the Mac OS box. They could kick it off remotely via this embedded tag in a web page someplace. So if you're running Safari 5.1, make sure you update it to 5.1.1 as soon as possible. Don't think I really had anything else I wanted to say about that other than a lot of patches and the new version of iOS, so you may see the update show up for your iPhone, your iPad, for the new version of iOS.
All right, so in theory, with an exploit like that, I could have an instruction on my website to say run the FTP program and download a file or something like that.
Yep.
To the local machine. So you
can
actually
the proof of concept that I saw, a friend of mine set it up, popped up a command window running and ran netstat in it.
Okay.
And the fact that just by browsing to a web page they could pop a window and run a command on my machine did not give me warm fuzzy feelings. So, but as soon as I applied this patch, that no longer worked. So I don't have the CVE number in front of me. It's in the bulletin that's displayed in the slide here, just below what's displayed here. But yeah, especially the Safari one is, I think, kind of serious. So you should apply that one as soon as possible.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you, Jim. So with that, I think we'll move on here. I have a couple of things to address related to DNS security. And, these are some thoughts that are sort of formulating here. I'm kind of leading toward a conclusion, but I think I certainly want to encourage your thoughts on this as we go along, Jim and John. And so, first of all, some observations. You may have some thoughts about this, but first of all, is a fairly recent, actually a very recent, I'll describe it as a discovery last updated October 12th. It was apparently originally posted on October 10th. This is from Tom Liston that had posted it to the ISC diary. And the dshield.org, the link to the story is shown here. And I think the main thing here is what we're talking about is DNS security. This is a case where existing DNS services were basically having additional domain names added, that is to their zone, that could be used, that were being used for basically, I think in this case, generally speaking, marketing sort of off things, performing sort of fraudulent activity, so to speak. So apparently what was happening here is the owners of these domains, basically the domain service providers, were effectively being hacked into and not providing good enough security around to protect the zones associated with these users. Another example that we have here in terms of security problems that exist with DNS is this case of DNS hijacking. That is, rather than adding additional domains that are being used, sort of piggybacking on existing zones, this is a case where existing domain names were being actually redirected to rogue sites. And I'm citing one example here. This was back actually in November this year, in September 5th this year, where this article was posted, where the Register, this is a UK-based news site, the Register actually had their DNS service provider hacked, and the attackers basically redirected their domain to a defaced version of the site. This was nothing that the Register themselves had been a victim of. That is, their systems weren't attacked, but it was actually the DNS service provider that was attacked, and it added negative implication on their site.
Yeah, and we've seen some other instances of this kind of thing in recent months, and the real question. It becomes a finger pointing thing. Was your password too weak? Or were the security controls at the registrar too weak? And everybody's pointing fingers at everybody else. But it's another example of an issue of is simple password authentication strong enough? You need to do something stronger to protect these kinds of things, I think. But
yeah, I think that the theme that's sort of developing here is that DNS is a really critical aspect of the internet infrastructure. And the integrity of the DNS infrastructure is an important aspect of this. And this is just two examples where we've seen basically the infrastructure itself being a victim of hacking activity one way or another. Let me correct that or adjust that slightly. Not necessarily a vulnerability of the service itself per se, but not providing good enough security to prevent it from being altered or victimized. And so, as you said, maybe the passwords weren't strong enough. Well, perhaps a reputable DNS service provider would be doing a better job at making sure that good passwords are in place. And so I think that's sort of two important observations associated with this. Here's another example of cases that actually exist. This is more malware on end users' machines that can exist. It's called DNS Changer. It's sort of the generic term. It's a type of malware or Trojan that can be actually packaged with other sort of botnet functions. But this is a case where the local settings on a computer, an infected machine, can be adjusted. And I think we'd reported on this. There are some other features that sort of have been built into this Trojan as well. One is that it can host a rogue DHCP server on a local network. And when it hosts that rogue DHCP server, what it tries to do is win a contest in terms of a race. That is, if somebody is looking for a DHCP server, it will offer its services, and in the course of doing that, provide a rogue DNS server in the settings that it provides to the clients on that local network. And then last but not least, this Trojan also has the capability to be able to log into home routers, a local router, and make adjustments to the to the DNS settings on a local router as well. I think generally speaking, just using the default passwords, but there's nothing that would prevent it from doing some sort of password guessing attack as well. And, you know, being on the LAN side of a router, we wouldn't necessarily expect that to be a serious security issue, but in this case, it turns out that it is. So this is another case where I'm citing an article that's describing DNS Changer that it was on the also on the SANS website, the IAC Diary.
Yeah, and once it's attacked the local router, the DSL router, the home router, whatever, if that's often where the DHCP server is for the segment, so then it can configure, the rogue DNS servers, and now it can do man-in-the-middle, redirect anybody to any place they want. So,
yeah. I was going to say, also related to that changing home router settings, there's a technique out there called drive-by DNS farming that can still be exploited against a lot of home routers, and it's similar to what Jim was mentioning, where in a web page you could put a little instruction, say file : / blah, blah, blah. It'll do something locally. Well, what they were doing is they would put a link on a web page that says http : / 192.168.1.1 / change DNS ? Blah, blah, blah. And you could actually, your local machine is reading that web page, then going and fetching and talking to your home router and changing the DNS settings, assuming you're using the default passwords, So it's actually your machine attacking its own router from the inside just by browsing a web page.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, this is three sort of issues that exist today. And, one of the things that has been happening recently is there's sort of a push toward implementing DNSSEC. DNSSEC is actually an extension to DNS that provides signatures on DNS responses. And in the course of doing that is intended to authenticate that the source is providing a valid response. My primary concern here is that the term DNSSEC seems to imply that it provides a good wraparound in terms of DNS security. But actually, that protocol, that extension that has been defined, has considered these sorts of attacks as out of scope for that solution. And so consequently, these three types of examples where zones are being expanded because of hacking into the DNS provider, where zones or domain names are being hijacked because of hacking into the provider, or end systems are compromised and the domain names, the users are pointed to a rogue DNS server, which can provide sometimes good answers, but also sometimes fraudulent answers. None of those are really protected very well, if at all, by DNSSEC. And so the question is there really a benefit to implementing DNSSEC? The next point that I wanted to sort of share here is this notion of DNS amplification attacks, which is not an attack against DNS per se. It turns out to be an attack against someone in terms of a denial of service attack. Basically, it's a method for flooding a target. And the way this is done is by having a botnet, for example, or some machines on the Internet send out DNS requests to legitimate DNS servers on the Internet and have the source address of those requests spoofed. Since DNS uses a UDP protocol, there's no connection, no exchange that takes place. So what ends up happening is those DNS servers will provide the response to those DNS requests and then provide those responses actually to a target of a denial of service attack. So what the target sees, the victim of the attack sees, is lots of DNS servers providing responses to requests that they didn't make. And that can flood the network or flood a server if they're flooding a DNS server that might be, in fact, more devastating because they can't really necessarily block the IP addresses that are sending those responses. So we've been doing some measurements on DNS amplification attacks, and in fact, what we found is over the last 90 days, we've seen on the order of about 4,000, somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 alarms that have detected DNS amplification attack activity taking place on the Internet. And so I showed a graph here. It's basically showing the number of alarms that we've picked up on a daily basis over the last 90 days. And the point here, the significance is, the way these attacks are facilitated is they tend to look for queries on the DNS servers that provide an amplification effect. That is, you ask a small question, you get a larger answer. And while this is not a problem with DNSSEC per se, it's actually a problem with DNS. It turns out that DNSSEC has the tendency to create larger answers. That is, you're not only getting the response that you've asked for, but you're getting a large, cryptographic signature on those responses that oftentimes is larger than the original answer. So it has an amplifying effect. So yet another sort of aspect of this that is, are we really looking in the right direction by, pushing toward implementing DNSSEC on the network, or should we be looking at finding ways to solve these problems with DNS and the security associated with DNS? So what I thought I'd share here is, very briefly, is some areas where I think we should be focusing on our improvements on DNS. And one of them, sort of first, is the accountability of DNS registry services. One of the things that we didn't discuss here is actually a large number of domain names are registered sort of in a fraudulent way. That is, we just talked about Zeus earlier. We talked about Configure in past segments, where, in fact, a lot of botnets are doing this, where they register domain names, use them in a fraudulent way, and there really isn't any accountability to the DNS service providers that provide those registries to be able to say, this person registered this domain. It makes it very difficult to chase down or determine who is behind these fraudulent activities or botnet activities. So that's one of the things that perhaps there are some ways we can improve the accountability, that is, be able to tie domain names more closely back to the users or the organizations that are registering those domains. A second aspect of this would be to set up some security standards for DNS service platforms. And I think the easiest way to do this might be to focus on the authoritative servers, at least at a starting point. That is, the intent here is to prevent this type of hacking of accounts by identifying some specific standards that should be used. We talked a little bit about passwords, strength of passwords. If they're going to continue to use passwords, there should be some strength standards associated with around that. And or perhaps better would be to require that a reputable DNS service provider provides strong authentication services to the organizations that are using those services. And this is an area where perhaps something like PCI, that is, would be an area that would want to influence this sort of thing. That is, the intent would be to keep users from being steered toward a fraudulent site. Oftentimes, those fraudulent sites are intended to provide phishing functions, that is, steal user identity and credentials. And so those that are doing credit card transactions, for example, may be motivated to say, if you want to provide authoritative services to organizations that are performing credit card transactions, you need to meet these sets of requirements. And it provides a market motivator to improve the security services of these DNS services. Another area that we might want to focus on is to look at perhaps detection and blocking of DNS cache poisoning. I didn't mention it earlier, but one of the primary motivators, the function intended around DNSSEC, is to prevent DNS cache poisoning. There was a sort of a hoopla, I'll call it, a little while ago, back in 2008, where Dan Kaminsky pointed out an exploit that could be done against DNS that would allow poisoning, that is basically to inject fraudulent answers within DNS resolvers, the caching servers, and use that to be able to direct victims to fraudulent sites, phishing sites, perhaps. There are actually a handful, and a handful I think is probably an exaggeration in a sense. There are a very small number, maybe one or two actual existence cases that I've been able to find where this has actually taken place, or at least evidence of that, of a DNS cache poisoning may have taken place. Now, since then, there was a patch applied to DNS servers to help prevent this kind of a thing from taking place. It's considered a workaround, sort of a fix in some respects, but it isn't really a strong preventer. It is still possible, given the right circumstances, to perhaps conduct a DNS cache poisoning attack. And there, in fact, was in July recently a documented case where a DNS server in Brazil was, in fact, showing fraudulent answers associated with some banking sites in Brazil. The evidence of perhaps a DNS cache poisoning was there, but there wasn't really evidence of the attack itself having taken place. So we don't know if that was a cache poisoning attack or not. But in any case, one of the things that would make sense is to set up some standards or encourage some standards where detection of DNS cache poisoning attempts would be a part of DNS services, reputable DNS services. And this will be part of the caching or the resolving aspect of services. And because of the Kaminsky patch, I'll call it the Kaminsky patch here, because of the patch that was intended to block the discovery that Dan Kaminsky had uncovered, it requires a large number of guesses to be able to have a reasonable expectation of success to do these cache poisonings. So it is, conceivable that reasonable detection algorithms could be put in place to help protect these without having to go through cryptographic methods. Next item here is one of the things that we could do is to fix DNS's susceptibility to spoof source amplification attacks. So I showed a graph on the frequency of amplification attacks that are taking place. I don't have necessarily the best solution here. One possible solution would be to transition DNS away from using UDP to using TCP. There are lots of drawbacks to that, certainly in the context of performance and the infrastructure that would be needed to support DNS. But that is one possible solution. That is, so long as you're requiring interactive transactions, it makes it much more difficult to spoof sources and create an amplifying effect against some unsuspecting and unwelcome victim.
And one of the things that we have for many years recommended as a best practice in enterprises is egress filtering, and that will help some of that. You only allow traffic out that is sourced from your own network. That prevents somebody in your network from spoofing and targeting somebody else. But that doesn't solve all the problems, and it doesn't solve the problem within an enterprise or within a network.
That's absolutely true. Another function that helps in this area as well is controlling who can perform queries against DNS servers. And while that's sort of an idealistic solution, I think there are some recommendations around that from the IETF in the form of RFCs. It's one that in some cases it certainly is a doable thing. In other cases it makes it relatively impractical to do, certainly for large service providers.
All right.
But,
yeah, we need to limit the amount of open resolvers on the Internet. If we had a lot less or hardly any open resolvers on the Internet, this problem wouldn't be possible. The fact that there's a lot of people running DNS in an open resolver type of way where they'll answer things not for just their own authoritative domains that they control, but for anything, that allows them to be used as unwitting participants in these amplification attacks.
That's relatively true, John. I think the one thing here that I'm a little concerned about is that as DNS, previously there were a limited number of queries that could be used to really create an amplifying effect. And I think as if we move forward with a lot of widespread deployment of DNSSEC, basically what that would make is every authoritative server that's on the Internet, of which there are millions of those, we would expect that every one of those would be answering their own domains and providing an amplifying effect associated with those. So I think you're right. Limiting the number of open resolvers helps, but I think that's one of the concerns that we need to be, paying attention to as we go forward. And last but not least here, this isn't really a DNS thing, but a lot of the concerns about having rogue domains or having domains that point to rogue sites can be minimized. The effects of those can be minimized by focusing on some improvements to SSL or TLS security. There was there's been some recent concerns about the security of certificate authorities, and in fact, I think it ended up causing that DigiNotar. I'm sorry, help me, Jim, here.
Yeah, DigiNotar went out of business.
DigiNotar basically ending up shutting their doors. I think that's a very unfortunate effect for them, but it is the right sort of market effect here. That is, they weren't providing the best security or sufficient security, and so ultimately they ended up going out of business for it. Unfortunately, at the consequence of having an attack against them. But that's one way that by setting up some standards for what it means to have to be a certification authority, I think is an important aspect of this. Another aspect of this that we could do to improve some things is to encourage strong authentication. And I'll use one sort of hypothetical scenario here. I have a banking provider. I want to be able to access that bank. Rather than logging into their website with a username and password that could be, I could be redirected to a phishing site and submitting that information. If the underlying authentication mechanism, the cryptographic authentication, provided a binding between a certificate that's provided to me that I keep on my machine and the security certificate that's on their server, then we could provide a mutual authentication that validates the connection and would not make it as easily susceptible to a phishing site. So that's one scenario. The details would need to be worked out on that, but I think there are some things that could be done here. That is to not rely so much on DNS as being able to provide exactly the right answer all the time and provide better security at the application level. So anyway, I'm interested in your thoughts here. Am I full of garbage? Well, with that, what I'll say is I'd like to open it up to the audience. Those that are listening, if you have thoughts on this, if you think I'm full of hot air, I'd like to hear about it. So, and I should have mentioned this earlier, but if you'd like to reach us, if you have suggestions, you can reach us at cyberthreat@list.at.com. So with that, I'll go ahead and move on to the next segment of our program, the Internet Weather Report. And I'll start out by saying that I don't think this is a particularly notable week in terms of activity on the Internet. There aren't any really significant events, but we have some things that we can take a look at. One is a rather unusual kind of thing to see here. What we're seeing is an increase in the what was detected as probes on TCP port 0 here. We see it's an increase in probes in terms of flows and packets. And TCP destination port 0, I don't think that's really associated with a particular application. That, quite frankly, I didn't even really look it up. It turns out this is related to some denial of service attack activity. In fact, it's predominantly backscatter from a denial of service attack. I will take a quick look at that a little bit later on here. We've been reporting for several weeks here activity on the scanning activity on port 23. That's Telnet. We'll just take a quick relook at that to see what the status is. And the next item here, a couple of ports that are related, although I don't have a really good explanation for at this point. So it turns out there is a source that's scanning on port 124 and 219. These happen to be related activities, so we'll take a quick look at that and see what kind of activity we're seeing there. There's also a little bit of activity scanning on port 53, that's destination port 53, that's associated with DNS. Some standard sort of activity, we'll take a look at it, related to scanning on port 5900. This is virtual network computing. And then we also have a couple other things that are showing up here. I just wanted to sort of note, and I don't think I included a graphic on this one, but we did have some sort of alerts associated with Protocol 6. Protocol 6 is also TCP. So it's a very sort of basic alert here. We're seeing a volumetric increase on flows. That happens to be related to denial of service activity too. So we won't dig into that any further, but something I thought would be worth noting. So let's go ahead and take a look at this this activity on 0 TCP. As I mentioned, it's a DDoS attack backscatter. So basically what's happening here is SYN packets are being thrown at a particular target. They're under a denial of service attack, and as a matter of their mitigation activities, they're trying to respond to those packets with a SYN-ACK. And in the course of doing that, basically the sources that, and presumably this is a case where the sources of the attack are spoofed addresses. And so what's happening is the SYN-ACKs are being sprayed around the internet, and you can see the activity that's taking place here. So we're seeing on the order of around 2 or so million of these flows per hour associated with this backscatter activity.
So why is it port 0?
Oh, good question there, John. The attack is actually against port 80. And the sort of strange aspect of this is at least a portion of the source ports and the attack packets, the SYN packets that are being sent, are using a fixed port 0. So it's a little easier to generate packets if you use a fixed port. You don't have to have a function that's generating, randomized ephemeral ports. But in this particular case, it shows up on the network as in terms of backscatter and raises an alarm. Good question. It's actually not unusual to see a fixed source port in scanning activity from time to time, and so we also see that. I'm not sure this is an example of that, but the next item is sort of an old friend here related to scanning activity on port 23, Telnet. We're showing 90 days of activity here just to show what the trend has been. We're continuing to see sort of a downward trend, but we also are still seeing that about 83%. We've been hovering around 70 to 80% of the sources are located in Korea here. It looks like there's still some mitigation activity going on. That is, we're continuing to see a decrease in activity. The next two, I just wanted to share that basically we have on port 124. I don't have an application associated with this particular port. That's 124 TCP, and the same for port 219 TCP, also an unknown port. The two of these are related. I'll go ahead and flip back and forth here, but you can see here that the profile of these two is very closely related in terms of the volume of activity and the timeline. And we'll have to see how this develops going forward, if this continues or if it's just sort of a spurious set of activities. And if anybody has some ideas on what applications might be that are targeted here, I'm certainly interested in that. Next item, I mentioned some scanning activity on port 53. This is DNS. And what we're seeing is not particularly notable. That is, over the last week or so, you can see the set of activity that's taken place. We've seen larger spikes in scanning activity previously. These aren't really high volume, but for completeness, I thought it would be worth showing, and no use dwelling on that. Next one, port 5900. This is virtual network computing. Basically, what we've seen is an increase in the number of sources that are doing the scanning on this port. And you can see here that we went from, around a noise floor of, say, about 50 or so sources that we typically see scanning. It jumped up in a couple of times up to about 10 times as much, about 550 sources at this peak. It's been a little bit spiky since then. It is not unusual for botnets to use this mechanism to go out looking for machines that they can target, perhaps performing password guessing attacks against these. The motivation might be to recruit new machines into the botnet or to look for inroads into enterprises that might be using this tool. So if you are using VNC, make sure you're doing it in a secure way. So that sort of concludes that segment. What I wanted to also share with you, and I think I've done this for the last couple of weeks here, is share what the distribution is. What we had talked about up to this point were areas where we had seen changes in activity, and so it's also helpful to look at steady state. So this is sort of the first view here where we're looking at the top 10 most probed ports. These are the ones that are getting the most probes. Far and above is port 445 TCP. We're going to take a little bit of a look at that over time in a few moments here. 1433 TCP is sort of a close second. In fact, I think there was a day in the last week that I noticed that 1433 exceeded port 445 in terms of the number of probes it got. 1433, I think, is Microsoft SQL Server, so certainly one that you want to pay attention to. Some other notables, this type 0 ICMP is generally related with to response activity that is associated with pinging activity. So this could be, in fact, in many cases, a backscatter from denial of service attacks that might be done some sort of a ping attack, for example. 3389, 2909 TCP, we also have been seeing that's related to a proxy application, port 22 SSH. So you can see the others here. Now, just to sort of flip this to another perspective, this particular pie chart is looking at the number of sources that are doing that probing, and this is a case where port 45 TCP is far and above the others. This is predominantly related to traditionally the configure worm, which has performed scanning on this particular port. It's also a popular target because for targeting weak file sharing applications that might be on the network. Following behind that, we have port 23 here, Telnet, and some other notables. We had talked about 1433, port 135, also Microsoft application, as well as 139 and 137. Now, last week, I think we talked about how sort of a downward trend I mentioned in terms of scan sources, the sources that are scanning on port 45 TCP. Over the last year, this is a year's worth of activity, we've sort of seen a downward trend, certainly in the last several months, where fewer sources are doing that scanning. That's a good news story, presumably associated with remediation activities, or perhaps even a lack of interest or a loss of interest of some botnets in scanning on that port. I did get a question about the, how the profile of probes has changed over that time period. And in fact, I believe that's also going down. Now, one of the things that's really difficult to measure here, the Internet is growing. It's continuing to grow all the time. And so we can't necessarily just look at the number of probes that are taking place. This is a sort of an attempt to look at it from a little different perspective, that is to look at the relative number of probes on port 45 relative to all of the flows that are on the Internet. And so using that model, whether you accept that or not, there certainly have been some surges in probing activity that have taken place on the network, but there still is what appears to be a downward trend in the number of probes that are taking place on the network as well. As I sort of suggested here, that trend is not as obvious if we just look at the raw count of the number of probes. And that concludes this portion of the program. Any other comments from the team here?
Nope, I think you covered it well.
Yeah.
Thank you. And with that, what I'd like to do is thank you, Jim. Thank you, John, for joining us today. As always, if you have questions or feedback or you have suggestions on topics we should cover, please drop us a line. You can reach us at cyberthreat@list.att.com. This program is available on the AT&T Tech Channel. That's techchannel.att.com. And you can also find it as a podcast on iTunes. You can find it on YouTube. Just search for the AT&T Cyber Threat Report. And once again, thanks, Jim and John, for joining us today. I'm Brian Rexroad, and on behalf of all of us here, keep your network safe.